Well, hello. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to talk for a little bit to give everybody a chance to log on. My name is Susan Weinstein. I'm co-executive director at Families for Depression Awareness, and you are here for our webinar on creating healthy tech and media habits with your teen. This is part of our teen mental health webinar series, and I am thrilled that you're here to join us. I will go ahead and get started because if people miss anything, then they can catch it on the recording. But I did want to make sure that you all know that this is in fact being recorded. It will be available on our website, along with the other webinars that we have available. And, we're thrilled to have you with us. We do these webinars a couple of times a year. We do generally 2 on topics in teen mental health and 2 on topics in adult depression. Every once in a while we get to throw in one on bipolar disorder, but we are fortunate to be able to share this information with you and to get truly awesome presenters to work with us. So our program today will be about 90 minutes long. We'll have lots of time for questions and answers. So please take advantage of the Q&A box to submit your questions. If you already submitted your question during registration, you don't need to do it again. We have it with us already. But if you want to, that's fine too. What else? We are a national nonprofit. We're based in Massachusetts. We have an office in Nashville. We were founded in 2001, so we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. Our mission is that we help families recognize and cope with depression and bipolar disorder to get people well and prevent suicides. We believe that depression and bipolar disorder affect the whole family, and we believe that families, in particular family caregivers, have an essential role to play in terms of their family's mental wellness and in suicide prevention. We believe that family caregivers are most often the ones to notice when something is wrong. They are generally highly motivated to do something about it because they care so much about their loved ones. And they are often in a good position to marshal the resources that are needed to get their loved one the care that they need. So we're all about the caregiver, and we are very happy to provide this education to help caregivers feel more equipped, educated, and confident in supporting their loved ones with depression or bipolar disorder. Our teen depression program has been going on since 2010. And in that time, we've trained more than 36,000 people, which is really exciting for us. We have our national webinars like this one. We also do in-person workshops in Massachusetts. We have teen and young adult speakers. They're volunteers who have their own lived experience that they share with their peers at schools and colleges and community settings, boys and girls clubs, things like that. So we're able to do that in Massachusetts. We also have on our website teen videos and family stories and expert interviews. We also have a YouTube channel where you can find some of these things too. And for our teen audience, we do have an Instagram account called Family Aware Teens. Our website, take a look at this one because you're not going to see it much longer if all goes well. We are at familyaware.org, which you probably know because you've probably registered through that. But we have reams and reams of information for caregivers and families about depression and bipolar disorder, about supporting loved ones. We have always been believers in storytelling. And so there are a lot of family stories about people's experiences dealing with depression, bipolar disorder, suicide attempts, suicide losses. And it's really part of the fabric of what we do. As you know, we have our teen speakers as well. We are launching a new website that will have a lot of the same great information that you have come to count on from Families for Depression Awareness, but hopefully in a more manageable and navigable way. So we're excited that presumably in May, we will see a new website. So please come back and see what else you can learn and give us feedback, because we love to hear from you all. Just to tell people, it makes sense for you to open up your chat, because our great staff people at Families for Depression Awareness will be dropping in links for you and bits of information. So what else we got? On our website, we also have web tools. One of the things that we did in the past couple of years is a caregiver stress test. I know you don't need to take a test to know that you have stress, but what we are offering is that it measures sort of your level of stress and then gives you some ideas for how to better manage it. So it's not something that you can fail. So check that out. We also have a depression and bipolar screening test. It's only validated for 18 and older, but it can help you with other family members or yourself to make sure that you're doing all right. One of the things on our website is that we have been working over the past few years to build out our webinar library. The Understanding Teen Depression presented by Dr. Mary Freistad is like our foundational course. If you haven't done that one yet, really recommend that you tune in for that one. You can catch it on demand anytime. And there we really cover the fundamentals that you need to know as a caregiver for a person living with depression. We also have a program that we did on pandemic parenting. We have done teen anxiety. We've done non-suicidal self-injury. We've done substance use and depression. We've done communication. So there's a lot of programs there for you to check out, as well as ones in adult topics. We also have publications. The one, I'm trying to think if it's on your left, if I'm seeing it on my left, but Helping Someone Living with Depression or Bipolar Disorder. It's our Caregivers Handbook. We used to have a brochure called Helping Someone Who is Depressed. And we decided it was time to redo that and change some of the language and some of the information. And we went from a 20-page booklet to a 60-page handbook. So check out our publications on our website. Today, we are going to be talking about teen technology and mental health and trends that we're seeing in that. We'll be looking at some common concerns and how you can address them, promoting healthy use of technology. Dr. Gansner has a whole significant interest in media planning, so we're really thrilled to be able to share that with you. We'll do questions and answers, and we always would ask that you do our survey so that we get your feedback on what we've done well, what we can improve, what topics you want to hear from us. Because we are very responsive to our audiences. A couple of years ago, probably more than that now, COVID timeframe makes things harder, but we learned from research that you're doing the right thing, that one of the best ways to intervene effectively to prevent suicides is to have a sense of connectedness with at least one adult, and that when those adults have been educated about depression and suicide prevention, it's an even stronger protective factor. So we've launched our first poll of the evening. So the question is, how confident are you supporting healthy use of technology with teens? So go ahead and choose what your level of confidence is, and that'll just give us a measure for as we move forward in the program. And what we're seeing is that most of you, about a third of you, no, about 45% of you are somewhat confident, and 19% are confident, and 33% are not confident. And we have very small numbers in the very confident and not sure. So it looks like everybody has some optimism about being able to learn from tonight's program. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, I think. And I'm going to go ahead and get to Dr. Gansner. I did not memorize this, so I am going to read it. Dr. Meredith Gansner is an instructor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and attending child psychiatrist at Cambridge Health Alliance in Massachusetts. Her research includes problematic digital media use by adolescents with significant psychiatric illness and the use of digital phenotyping in assessing and managing problematic internet use. For her research, Dr. Gansner has been awarded the Henry G. Altman Award for Excellence in Medical Education, a DuPont Warren Fellowship Grant, and the Eleanor and Miles Shore Faculty Development Award through Harvard Medical School. She's also an active member of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Media Committee and has written articles about problematic digital media use for the Psychiatric Times, Cognoscenti, the Boston Globe, and Slate magazine. It is my great pleasure to turn the program over to you, Dr. Gansner. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. All right, so now I have to share my presentation. Oops. Give me 1 second.
And as soon as you're able to get started, I will make myself invisible. It's a talent.
All right, of course, now suddenly it's not offering me my presentation. So
well, if worse comes to worse, I can go back to sharing and you can just tell me when you want to advance.
Always.
Plan B, I'll be here.
Yes, we might need to plan B it. I don't know why it's not offering me. It's always good that I'm talking about digital media and I am failing to work digital media.
All right,
good thing I was allowed to answer that poll. All right, awesome. Can I just ask you then when to
Sure,
switch?
of course.
Awesome. All right. So today we're going to be talking about teen technology and mental health trends. The gist of this talk is really to get a sense of common areas where teens might struggle in their use of digital media. And hopefully at the end, to give a better sense of how you might be able to manage some of that problematic use without having to rely necessarily on knowing the exact type of digital media use. We know digital media tends to move very quickly. Research gets outdated very quickly. And so it's helpful to have a kind of structured approach when thinking about helping your teenager or your child with their media habits. So hopefully that is what I will be providing, even though I can't seem to find my slides using Zoom. So next slide. It's always really helpful to start out a talk about digital media use by just covering the basics of what teens and tweens are using and how much they're using. So when we look at tweens, and that's the age group between 8 and 12 years of age, about 41% have their own smartphones, and they spend the bulk of their time in passive media use. And basically that means watching television, watching videos, scrolling through social media feeds. That's basically what they're doing online for the majority of time. They're using screens. And they spend a little bit under 5 hours per day using screens. For teenagers, these numbers increase significantly, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who's seen a teenager in the last decade. Most recent estimates suggest that up to 95% have their own smartphone. And again, similar, I think, to actually probably most people, myself included, the largest amount of time spent on screens is still in passive use. So watching videos, scrolling the internet, scrolling social media platforms. But because teenagers are far more dependent on social relationships and starting to engage socially, that's kind of where their social currency is online now. And so they're far more likely to engage in social media. So that's why we start seeing some more problematic use of social media, specifically around the time someone turns 13, 14. About 45% of teenagers are estimating themselves that they're constantly online. That includes at nighttime. And again, from 2019, they estimated that about teenagers were about up to 9 hours on screens per day. Now, I imagine in the last several years, this has changed significantly, right? Like we went through a pandemic where almost everybody had to move their lives online. Extracurricular activities went online. Teens weren't able to socialize as much in person. So I would think that the statistics would show an increased amount overall for most youth these days in terms of amount of time spent on screens daily. We're just kind of waiting for that survey to come out. In terms of what they're using, again, this is a little bit dated because this is pre-TikTok, but back in 2019, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and YouTube were the most popular apps used, with YouTube being the most popular one. Again, I'm pretty sure TikTok is up there now. We just are waiting for the new survey. It's a nationally done survey to kind of give us the information about what teens are using from as large a group of teenagers as possible. So next slide. Thank you. So before I talk about some of the negatives of social media and digital media, it's really important that I kind of step back and say, social media has a lot of positives to it. I mean, I don't think that's a surprise to anyone in this talk right now. We certainly give social media a bad name. I think media tends to take articles related to scary things online, especially related to teenagers, and kind of run haywire with them, posting them as headlines. But there's a lot of good that comes with social media. And these are some statistics from the Pew Research Center, which is an excellent place to get information about how youth are using social media for good and for ill. And they, as I said, they do some fantastic surveys, kind of getting a sense of how kids are using social media. And the first graph on the left that I'll talk about is really focusing in on online groups and how helpful those can be to teenagers. The majority of teenagers who spend time on online groups do so to connect with others surrounding hobbies and gaming specifically, or specific games. This is huge because obviously many teenagers, many of us know teenagers who have very specific interests and likes. They might like a very specific type of game. They might like a rare type of humor or pop culture or sport. And online is a place where they can connect with others surrounding that hobby or interest, where they might not find people who connect to them in their geographical location. I think that if you move just to the next, there should be a red box that will, yes. I also like to highlight health and wellness groups as well. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. I think it's particularly relevant these days, but a lot of teenagers like to go online also to find connections surrounding health and wellness, those who are suffering from psychiatric illness, those who are suffering from medical illnesses. If they don't feel like they can connect with people who know what they're going through, I mean, their kind of direct environment at school, oftentimes they might choose to go online and find groups to connect with others surrounding that. In terms of the middle graph, I like this graph because it really helps me reflect on how digital media, social media specifically, can help adolescents in their normal development. In psychiatry and psychology, we consider adolescence, the time where teenagers really are trying to figure out who they are. It's called the period of identity formation and figuring out their role in life. And this graph really kind of alludes to that, suggesting that social media is a way that teenagers can feel more accepted. They start to explore different types of people that they might not be able to associate with or connect with in their geographical location in real life. And it helps them figure out who they are, how they feel about important issues, what they care about. So many teenagers have really strong kind of roots in activism and things and passions that they care about. And social media can help to direct that and help them to act on those things that they're passionate about. And then finally, the graph on the right, I like to include this because when social media first came about in the early aughts, there was this thinking that, oh no, now teenagers will no longer connect with individuals outside of the internet and all of their friends will be online. But that actually really isn't how it's panned out. This study looked specifically at those youth that felt that social media had a positive effect or a negative effect or a neutral effect. And while the majority of youth felt like it was kind of both positive and negative, a lot of the youth who said that it was mostly positive felt this way because they could actually connect more with their friends and their family. And that's existing friends and family, right? So we're not talking about just friends and family from online, but actually using the internet to solidify those relationships that they have in real life, those real people that they know. And that's something to, I think, always come back to, that social media really should be a tool that we use to connect with others that we know ideally in a healthy and safe way. Next slide. But there still may be consequences. And this is something that for the last 10 years, I have really started to, I think, get increasingly concerned by those youth that are susceptible to social media behaviors that are risky and dangerous. And I first got into doing digital media research because I was rotating back in medical school in the pediatric emergency room, and we were seeing more and more children who were coming in related to psychiatric crisis surrounding their use of the internet, whether the internet was taken away from them or their phone was taken away or they got bullied. And then when I went to residency, I continued research there on an inpatient psychiatric unit, asking adolescents over the course of 4 years, why are you here? Basically, it's your being here, anything to do with your being online. And we surveyed hundreds of adolescents and found that a third of the adolescents that we surveyed actually had their admissions were related to their digital media use. And the table 5 here on the right is from this paper that I published on that study of those adolescents. And a lot of them felt that they were in the hospital because of issues that had occurred online, mostly interpersonal relationships where they were being bullied, or there was a breakup online, there was you can see friend drama online. And I want to emphasize, I know that this is something that teenagers have been dealing with for, eons, right? Social drama is nothing new with a teenager, but social media and digital media specifically, it provides kind of an outlet to drama in a way that kind of in-person connections don't necessarily reflect, right? Like social media, when we have it, it's kind of always with us, and it allows for a child to not be able to escape the drama and to escape kind of the interpersonal issues that might be otherwise plaguing them and making it hard for them to function. And so I think that that's why it's so important that we're aware of social media and the impact that social media can have on youth that are vulnerable and in psychiatric distress. Next slide. Okay. So what does the research tell us? So for as long as I've been doing the research, there have been tons of other researchers who've also been doing research on looking at youth specifically and saying, what do we know about this? What do we know about the time spent online and the impact that it has on our kids? Well, a lot of scientists have basically said, okay, well, let's just start with time of use. How much time they're spending online and on phones. Does that seem to relate to the psychiatric well-being of these kids? And they have found connections between social media use, the time online specifically being related to worsening depression, decreased well-being, low self-esteem, and poor body image, just being a few of the things that they found. However, I will say those headlines tend to get a lot of play in the media. They tend to get highlighted. They're kind of, in my personal opinion, alarmist. Social media is causing everyone to be depressed. And there are a bunch of other studies that have looked at Facebook depression and have actually found the opposite, that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the amount of time you spend on social media and online and psychiatric symptoms resulting from that. I will add in that the research that I do is predominantly in children who have existing psychiatric illnesses. So these are all kids who are currently in treatment for depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder. And I actually, in 3 separate studies, have not found any connection between time spent online and the severity of psychiatric symptoms. So I think if I'm going to come down on one side or another on this issue, I think it's probably much more likely that children who are already struggling are just more likely to spend an increased amount of time on social media and online. And I'll talk a little bit about why that might be in future slides. Okay. Now, what about quality of use? What about how you're using the internet? I think there is a little bit more to this research, perhaps, than just connection between the amount of time you spend online and your well-being. So how you use the internet, not necessarily what you're using or how much you're using, but how you use the internet, is that related to your psychiatric symptoms? And people have looked at rumination or co-rumination. And this is basically the idea of how much are you spending time online, talking, mulling over a kind of personal issue, by yourself versus doing it with friends. And they have actually found that when you co-ruminate, so you're kind of mulling over a personal issue with a small group of people, that actually strengthens the bond in that relationship, and that actually helps that existing relationship. Whereas if you're doing it by yourself, that's actually not as helpful for your mental health. Also looking at active and passive use. I mentioned passive use a few slides back, the idea that you're just online, as kind of it suggests, passively scrolling, watching television. And, they found, unsurprisingly, I think, that people who just spend time scrolling, spend time looking at other people's profiles, watching TV, that use is far more likely to be associated with anxious and depressed mood than being more actively engaged in your social media use. So there does seem to be some correlation between how you're using the internet and social media and your psychiatric outcomes. Next slide. And then there's the additional issue of what if it's not even related to the media or just something that happens to be different when you're using media. And one of the biggest factors is sleep, unsurprisingly. I have met so many children who have their phones next to them at night and who tell me that they go on their phones and respond to texts while they should be sleeping, so that they are not sleeping all the way through the night. So that's hugely problematic in and of itself. So unsurprisingly, high social media use tends to lead to greater sleep disruption because they're answering texts in the middle of the night. We also know that blue light emitted from devices does impact the secretion of melatonin in your brain, which is something that your brain kind of needs to prepare to kind of get ready for sleep, which is why people take over-the-counter melatonin to kind of help prepare their bodies for sleep and go to sleep. So that's another factor in our use of devices and social media and its impact on sleep. And one study actually found that if you improved sleep, any of the relationship between social media use and negative mental health outcomes actually improved. So it seemed to be that sleep itself is probably very responsible for the poor mental health outcomes that have been connected with it in other studies. Again, in the population that I treat, kids who are suffering from depression and anxiety and trauma, I will not reduce it to saying that if we just fix their sleep, all the problems would fix themselves. I think that's a little bit reductionist, but that said, I don't want to underestimate how important sleep is for mental health of everybody, adults included. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about most common concerns. This is not an exhaustive list. There are tons of additional concerns that wouldn't fit in this presentation, but these are some of the ones that I think it's really important to mention. So we're going to start with cyberbullying. So I start this slide off by saying, what is cyberbullying? And I recognize that sounds like a kind of a stupid statement, because I think people will say, well, cyberbullying is just bullying, but it's online. Like, what can you not understand about it? But in all honesty, the more that I have thought about cyberbullying and talked about it with other people who research cyberbullying, and the more that digital media and social media change over time, the more I'm somewhat convinced that cyberbullying is kind of nebulous at times. It is very different in certain aspects than traditional bullying. People have thought to sort of define cyberbullying as saying, okay, well, it needs to be an act that is repetitive. There needs to be a power imbalance. So it can't just be friends kind of joking with each other, right, who are kind of on the same playing field. And there has to be intent. There has to be the intent to hurt somebody else. But I think that even though, again, this should be obvious, I don't think it is always that obvious, especially to the recipient of the bullying. I think that when we are not able to see necessarily the intent of the person saying a statement, it can be somewhat hard for the youth who, they get a text saying, "You're stupid, no one will ever like you." A youth might be like, well, it might be a joke. I mean, it's my friend saying it, so maybe it's not bullying. Another example that I've frequently encountered is youth that it might not even be kind of a direct communication, but there might be a group of friends and they decide to exclude one member of a group and then post about what they did together online, knowing full well that the person that they excluded is going to be able to see what they did without them and get upset and be upset. Those children that I see who are kind of purposely excluded online, they oftentimes don't recognize that is a form of bullying, right? That's a form of intentionally hurting somebody else, but they might not even realize that that's what's happening because it's not as direct offense or direct kind of offensive statement or a direct insult to them, right? It's something that's a little bit more nebulous. So I think cyberbullying is something that it isn't always obvious. So it's important that you kind of keep that framework in mind. Thinking about statistics with cyberbullying, it is fairly common. The people who are bullied in person are the ones most likely to be bullied also online. It's highly correlated with depression and suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. But what is notable about cyberbullying is that there is an increased risk of suicide attempts and suicide itself when compared to traditional kind of in-person bullying. And I think that's in large part to the nature of cyberbullying, right? Where you can have cyberbullying that comes into the home in a way that parents might not realize their child is being bullied. Even it can be completely quiet. I've met so many youth who've been cyberbullied in some way online, and their parents really have had no way. The schools had no way of knowing what's happening, and I treat so many youth for whom their way to escape stress and negative feelings is to go online. And when you're going online to the place where you are also being bullied to seek support, you kind of get stuck in this vicious cycle where you can't escape from the cyberbullying, even though you are trying to. And so I think that's why cyberbullying is probably a lot more, I don't want to say risky, but it certainly is associated with, I think, some increasingly concerning negative mental health outcomes compared to traditional bullying, because it is, again, more nebulous, harder to recognize, and a little bit more insidious in terms of how it goes into the home and can be unrecognized for longer periods of time. Awesome. We also looked at cyberbullying in my study, looking at youth and their, I guess, relationship to digital media and their psychiatric admission. I found that cyberbullying was the most common reason why youth were admitted to the hospital. So again, like a third of our population that we sampled said that they were in the hospital because of something related to digital media. And then a third of them said that that was related to cyberbullying specifically. So it's a huge concern, particularly in the population of youth that I treat. Now, talking about FOMO, I think everyone who's seeing this has probably heard of FOMO, fear of missing out, but just in case, to define it, it can be just defined as anxiousness caused by compulsive concern that a teen or person or adults might miss an opportunity for social interaction, a rewarding experience, or other satisfying event. I mentioned on the prior slide that there's certainly an experience of FOMO that might be kind of an intentional induction of FOMO by kind of a frenemy or a bully. This is just FOMO just because of FOMO, the idea that you aren't being invited to something, the idea that you're missing out or engaging in something that you otherwise should be. And I think that also it can be a social situation, but I also think that we should go beyond kind of what it as is a satisfying event or like a specific event, but even like a developmental stage, right? So if a teenager is seeing their friends all applying for colleges or all getting summer jobs or all having relationships, those are developmental stages, so to speak, that they could feel FOMO about, that isn't really a specific party or a specific device that they might want or a specific gadget. It's a fear that they're missing out on a component of their life that they aren't going to get and that they're going to miss out on. And so we know that people who are experiencing that actually do tend to be more likely to go online and spend more time online, which in my mind sometimes is a little bit counterintuitive, because it's like going online might not actually help you to attain what you were trying to. But because so many of our youth use the internet as a way to regulate how they're feeling and their feelings of inadequacy or low self-confidence or low self-esteem, that they will then continue to go online, potentially trying to craft themselves a better image of themselves online, to really kind of prop themselves up, to get likes, to feel better in other ways, through their kind of digital currency of likes. And it leads to more problematic use of the internet and inability to connect from the internet. So it's really crucial to get a sense of how your teen or other youth are kind of navigating their ability to go online in a way that, we're all going to have fear and disappointment that we might not be in on things, but it's really important that we check in with our kids about, how much that's impacting them and how much they might feel disappointed or left out when they're going on social media, and then helping them to separate and kind of put that disappointment to kind of channel healthier habits and other ways that they can gain self-confidence and feel like they've gained mastery of some other thing other than just their social media use. Next slide. All right, online challenges, poll time, and water break. So do you know a teen who has participated in an online challenge? I admittedly don't know how long people are supposed to get to fill this out, so. No, so 44% of people said no, 34% said yes. Oh, I don't know. Interesting. I guess it's probably about what I would have thought in terms of people who are kind of aware of online challenges. I think online challenges are, I think that certainly they're everywhere. And I think the ones that are probably the most dangerous or the most kind of hot to talk about tend to get the most play in the media. So these are all pictures of online challenges over the last decade. But I would imagine that most of you probably recognize the one on the left, the Tide Pod, as being kind of one of the most talked about challenges, where kids were apparently daring each other to ingest Tide Pods. But the reason I have the other ones on here is that these are all kind of challenges that have been cropping up periodically over the last decade. There are also far more challenges that I just didn't even put on this slide, because there are lots of ways to engage in online challenges, and that's certainly along the spectrum of kind of ones that are very more positive or like very, lighthearted and silly, to ones that are obviously much more dangerous, like ingesting Tide Pods. So you have the Tide Pod challenge. There was the cinnamon challenge, where you were supposed to try and eat a tablespoon of cinnamon. There was a shot glass challenge, which I believe was related to, it's one of the Jenners. It was either Kylie or Kendall. I apologize that I don't remember which one it was, but to try to kind of plump up your lips using a shot glass. The one on the bottom are condoms. People were daring each other to snort condoms. And then the one on the bottom right was the eraser burns, where you would try to see how long you could go burning yourself with an eraser, and whoever managed to go the longest was the winner of that challenge. So there are all sorts of different kinds of online challenges that crop up on the internet. Next slide. And I'll be the first to say that I think some of these challenges, for example, like the blue whale challenge, which was supposed to be this challenge that kind of originated, I believe, in Russia, and people were, it was like the series of challenges that you get closer and closer, they get kind of scarier and scarier, and the last challenge was that you would kill yourself. And there wasn't actually, that was a hoax. Like, there was no actual blue whale challenge. But I think the concerning thing is it kind of took off, and some of these challenges I think can actually become alive and gain a life of their own, even though they weren't actually challenges to begin with. They were sort of made up. And that's due to the sheer amount of media exposure that some of these challenges get, which I am extremely concerned about, but that is for a separate rant on a separate day. And as I said, these things can be real. In the first half of January 2017, Poison Control handled 39 cases. So that's like roughly 2 weeks. They handled 39 cases of intentional ingestion of detergent packets, which was as many as they got in all of 2016 related to the intentional ingestment of detergent packets. So certainly people do seem to be engaging in online challenges. And as for who those youth are, again, think about those youth that are struggling to kind of figure out who they are, struggling to find acceptance, struggling to find a way to feel good about themselves. Those are the kids that are more likely to engage in these things. The kids that I treat, for example, in the youth that I surveyed, 22% of them said that they had participated in online dares. And again, this was from now 5 years back. I'm willing to bet that it's probably at higher levels now. Next slide. All right, meeting strangers online. This is actually, I think, far more common than people realize. For our population, when we surveyed them, they said about 25% at that point had in-person meetings with people that they had met online. So they didn't view them as strangers. They were, boyfriends or girlfriends or close friends. And, they would actually take offense at me saying like this is a stranger to them, because it wasn't a stranger. But that said, they had never met them before. And certainly for those of us that I guess maybe elder millennials or Gen Xers or older than that, it tends to be a little frightening, the idea that you're meeting with people that you haven't actually ever met in person, and you don't know whether they are the person that they say they are. Unsurprisingly, meeting strangers online is correlated with problematic use of the internet and cyberbullying. And something that I really would like to emphasize here is that A, not only that it's just, I think, more common than a lot of people realize, but B, I have encountered many youth who have been engaged in some sort of relationship with an adult online. Sometimes it can get very dangerous very quickly for that adolescent. And so I always kind of warn parents that if they've discovered that their child is in a relationship with an adult online, and they will see it as a relationship, obviously, it's a predatorial one, that it is very important that you keep a very close eye on that teenager in kind of the ensuing complications. Understandably, you're going to be incredibly reactive about it, especially if law enforcement gets involved, which it often does. That is totally understandable. But I've seen many teenagers for whom everything gets caught up in a whirlwind so quickly, and they have been really relying on that relationship, as problematic as it was, for their sense of kind of support and sense of self for like the last months sometimes. And when they then have that relationship broken open, they find themselves oftentimes without the device because it gets taken away by law enforcement, and they then no longer have a way to warn that person about the fact that law enforcement is aware of what's been going on. They oftentimes will find themselves kind of in this spiraling sense of guilt and shame. And I've seen many youth that have tried to injure themselves or maybe suicide attempts kind of in the setting of this. And so I always kind of warn parents that, if you are ever aware of this happening with your teen, again, totally understand that it's human nature to be very reactive and frightened for your youth, but it's also really important to keep checking in with them and making sure that they're getting the support that they need surrounding that relationship. Because while to you it's a terrifying relationship, to them it was a source of support often. And so it's just important to realize that when they suddenly lost that sense of support and their digital media, they're in a very vulnerable spot. Next slide. Okay, meeting strangers with shared purpose. So I also like to talk a little bit about extremist forums, especially kind of in the last several years. We've had more and more of a shift, I think, towards recruitment for right-wing forums through the internet. I think when I first started to engage in this research, there was a lot more concern, and I actually saw a lot more of kids that were kind of navigating interest in joining ISIS and more international extremist forums rather than kind of homegrown extremist forums. And that's far more what we're seeing nowadays. And so I think it's really important. I wish I didn't have to talk about this, but it's always important to just think about this, that youth that are vulnerable, again, youth that really are struggling with their self-esteem and a sense of self, are going to be incredibly easy prey to extremist forums. People who do research in this area kind of find these four main components that really kind of draw a youth in. One of those being mortality salience. So the idea of really emphasizing that you are mortal, that you have one life to live, that your death is imminent, as it is for everybody, but kind of prepping them by telling them, your death is imminent. People, people are going to die, and kind of how do you want to be remembered, so to speak. Then moral outrage, getting people to kind of fear that their way of life is being compromised in a way that they need to be protecting it and they need to be reacting. Role playing, this is something that's incredibly easy to do online, but the idea that you can get youth to sort of fantasize about what their life would be like if they were to be able to be an important person within a sort of extremist group, and they would get a lot of confidence, and they would be they would get a lot of compliments and recognition, and people would be so excited about to get to meet them, and kind of building up their sense of self and saying, like, think how awesome this could be if you engaged in X. And then lastly, it's far easier to get a hold of people and kind of draw them in online than it would be otherwise if you weren't moving through social media platforms, especially covert platforms. And so it's always something just to be aware of. The link here is an article in the BBC News that was excellent, it was a mom talking about her teenager being recruited online to an extremist forum, and how she kind of slowly started to realize that this was happening, and what she noticed. And so one of the things that she mentions that I always talk about is the idea that you can you always want to, as much as you can, be abreast of what your child is doing online, right? But one of the ways that you can start to maybe get a sense that something is off or something is different is if your child suddenly starts to espouse views that they previously had never mentioned before. So, it's obviously very normal. I see this with my patients all the time, where they suddenly have views that are maybe a little bit out there. They're exploring kind of new thoughts or new things that they're passionate about, new passions and new ideas and new philosophies. That's totally understandable. That's part of adolescence. But if they start to say things that are flagrantly racist or misogynist or anything along those lines that are just very out of character with their otherwise normally held values, it's worth starting to kind of check in with them about where they heard that from. Again, so instinctive to want to be like, what did you just say? And to kind of react. But I always encourage parents as much as they can to try to step back and actually explore more with their teen how they developed that thought, where it came from, where they learned it. Because I think if one tends to respond reactively, you're at risk for them feeling ashamed and shutting down. And then that sort of feeds further into their engagement into this kind of alt forum that might be kind of a fray of like the normal social media streams that more people are on. So it's always, as much as you can, yes, you can go to the next one. Just good to keep an open mind surrounding that and approaching it. Health information forums. I'm bringing this up now because it's been especially important in the last year, but it's always been something that I encourage with youth that are struggling with, particularly illnesses that aren't common, where they might not be able to find people in their close proximity at their schools who are going through what they're going through, right? It can help them form connections with others that get them and can favorably impact treatment outcomes for those illnesses. But it's really important to know what health forum people are using and what groups people are on, right? TikTok is not a health information forum, as much as every single child I see thinks that it is. I think, have all been well aware over the last year, mostly year, but probably a year or two, of teenagers kind of increasingly diagnosing themselves, particularly with certain mental health issues from TikTok videos. There are certainly some amazing clinicians out there that do have TikTok profiles in an attempt to kind of challenge that. But again, it's always really important to know, who your teen is listening to, where they're engaging in these groups and forums, because certainly there are people who will say that they are experts in X and, might not actually be experts in X. So I tend to, rather than just kind of blanketly say like, well, these forums are always fine associated with this society and whatnot. I think it's just always good to, first and foremost, just do your research. If your teen says that they're on some sort of forum talking to others who are suffering from X condition, always just good to ask where that is and know a little bit more about it. Next slide. All right, video games. So this is another one of those really hot button issues that over the last few years, but probably more than that now, probably decade, it's kind of gone back and forth, ping-ponging between, is it bad for you? Is it dangerous? Does it cause aggression? Does it not cause aggression? I think it can be very tempting to blame violent video games for aggressive acts. Finally, a few years ago, the American Psychological Association put out a statement saying that after reviewing all of the studies, they did actually find some connection between increase in aggression and playing violent video games. I will note that when they kind of compiled all the studies together and came up with their final findings, it was a very small increase, like a very small increase. And also, it's really important to mention that this is aggression, not violence. So when I say aggression, I'm talking about things like even just verbal aggression, not necessarily an increase in physical violence. So that's important to remember. And I think something that is important to emphasize with that is that video games are created to kind of hijack the part of your brain that sort of gets sort of dependent and basically releases dopamine. And that's a chemical in our brains that makes us kind of want to keep doing things like gambling or things that make us happy and gives us positive feedback. And video games are designed and so there's a lot of social media with the intent that you keep playing this. They want you to keep playing this. And so it oftentimes becomes something that is increasingly hard to separate from. Additionally, gaming is an area where many youth can find a sense of confidence, a sense of identity, a sense of, if they're feeling like they otherwise are terrible at things, if they think that they're good at playing video games. I've met so many teens for whom they are super, super proud of that. And that's awesome. And it's great that it's something that gives them a sense of mastery. However, in youth that are particularly susceptible, that may have underlying psychiatric issues, they're far more likely to become dependent on their use of gaming to the point where they really can't separate from it well. And I think many of us have heard about teenagers for whom, when you try to take away their gaming console or their phone, if they're phone gaming, it can lead to aggressive outbursts. I see it all the time. And so I think that something that wasn't really highlighted as much with this report that the American Psychological Association put out is that the increase in aggression can also be related to just the inability to separate from the gaming itself. And that's something that's really important to remember. I mean, the gaming itself is it's hard to sometimes separate from it. I won't use the word addictive because that's a very hot button word, but certainly people have connected one's part of the brain that develops addictions to the areas of the brain that are engaged when playing games and video games in particular, such that now internet gaming disorder has actually been recognized by the World Health Organization. So just something to think about. But again, as with everything, there are still potential benefits to playing video games. As I mentioned, not only is it a place where you can connect with others, it's a place where you can also gain a sense of mastery. I have known many psychiatrists actually who use it with their patients as a way to allow a teenager to talk in a more comfortable way. So while they're gaming, they find that sitting side by side with a psychiatrist, or this can also be extrapolated to with their parents, they're able to talk about those things that are bothering them in a way that they couldn't do if they weren't kind of simultaneously doing a game while talking to somebody. Just the interpersonal relationship, one-on-one, it was just kind of too overwhelming for them if it's a kid, especially on the spectrum or who has social anxiety. So there are many really potential benefits for video games, but again, it's always important to just remember the downsides as well. So promoting healthy use. I talked a lot about the potential dangers. Now time to talk about what to do about it. So I always like to start off this part of the talk by just mentioning the digital divide. And that's something that when I first created this slide and first started doing these talks pre-pandemic, digital divide was something that people really hadn't heard as much about. But now, because we've had a pandemic and everyone suddenly needed internet access, now, fortunately, we do have much greater recognition that it is really vitally important that people have internet access. It is hugely, hugely, hugely important. So even though there are all these negative issues with internet use and social media, the answer is certainly not to just take it away. The American Medical Informatics Association actually considers broadband internet access to be a social determinant of health. So saying that we know people who do not have internet access are likely to have worse health outcomes. Additionally, we know from an academic standpoint, people who are less likely to have broadband internet access are less able to do their homework, less able to succeed academically. This is something that we need to be aware of, and people need internet access. I mean, I think at this point, we all know that goes without saying. Next slide. But what is internet access if we don't know how to use the internet? And that is where digital media literacy comes in. And it's fortunate that especially in Massachusetts, there's some fantastic public school districts that have really started to incorporate digital media literacy from an earlier grade level. So like starting in kind of elementary school. And that is hugely, hugely important. But I think it's always something that I've spoken to many teachers who are still kind of struggling with the idea being that it's just not enough, and B, the idea being that it's just not soon enough. I mean, a lot of teachers actually think that it should be started this curriculum at like age 5 or 6. And there is curricula available for that age group, because that is when, I think my own child, she's 5, she figured out how to order something on Amazon before I even thought that she would be able to. So it's definitely important that we start as early as possible when kids have access to screens, with knowing how to use it and knowing, how to think critically about what they're seeing online. And these questions specifically are definitely not for 5-year-olds, but are more geared towards teenagers who are maybe starting to explore other forums online, starting to gain information on the internet. The vast majority of teenagers today do get their news through the internet and social media. And I think the statistic I saw was like 30% of them found out that some of what they've seen was later proved false. So it's really important that we help our teenagers know how to appraise the media content that they're looking at. So knowing about who posted it, why a person might have wanted to post this, who is the audience for this content, what do you think that the post creator wants people to do or think in seeing the content? Again, where did the authors get their information from, right? Did they get it from somebody's blog versus an accredited website? Again, when was the content written or updated? You want it to be up to date and updated as frequently as possible if new information arises. And again, why do you think this content was posted? Why now? And why is it there? Those are all great questions to get teens to start thinking about things that they see online. Next slide. Another thing that I really encourage parents, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I encourage parents when they're dealing with any sort of difficult digital media related issue with their teenager, it's so normal to want to react. You will want to react. it's instinctive, right? It's so hard to just not react. But I really, as much as you can, when your teenagers do something that may be incredibly alarming, or when you're thinking about it, or like, that's so incredibly stupid, why are you eating a Tide Pod? Try to be curious. It's the best way to get your child to sort of open up and start talking with you. And that will really help you, kind of leading to the next things I'm going to recommend, starting to talk about media planning. So these are some resources for parents and caregivers. Common Sense Media and Child Mind Institute both provide some great guidelines. Common Sense Media, I always recommend to parents because it actually will tell you about different games and whether they recommend different games for teens, whether they're appropriate or not, or younger kids. It will kind of rate apps. I think it's a great resource. So I definitely give Common Sense Media a plug for sure. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that you put your device to bed. So way back in the beginning when I talked about sleep, I always without fail tell my parents of the kids that I'm treating, please separate from the phone at night. It's too late by the time I see the kid, but in general, before you give your child a phone, make the expectation be that their device is not in the room at night. It's too much of a temptation to have it in their bedrooms at night. Even if they're using it to listen to music, it's too risky. It should be out of the room. And as soon as possible, you really need to begin teaching them about media literacy and then media planning. And the American Academy of Pediatrics has a template about media planning, which I'll talk about now. Move to the next slide. So obviously, we know media used thoughtfully is a great tool in life. American Academy of Pediatrics created a template for a family media plan, which I think is a great starting point. But I'd like to spend the next few slides sort of talking about some things more specifically and kind of what I've seen and how I like to tailor media plans for the families that I treat. So most psychiatrists or psychiatrists, psychologists, mental health professionals who do media planning, we all sort of tend to go with the same approach. It's amazing because I've kind of independently seen very similar media planning strategies crop up from many different mental health professionals, which is good because I think we're kind of all doing similar things. And that's kind of just thinking very broadly at first about the what, the who, the how much, and the when and the where. So thinking, what types of media are going to be the media that you allow your child to use. So is that going to be like Instagram? Is it going to be just internet, surfing the internet for school? What are they going to be allowed to use? Who are they allowed to talk to, strangers or just people that they know? How much? Thinking about how many hours per day you want to allow your child versus weekends versus weekdays, and recreational versus kind of educational media use. I always say agree on holidays beforehand. So if there are times like family dinners when you want everybody to be off of devices, then make sure they know that as part of the media plan beforehand. Don't just spring it on them. Contingencies are also not really addressed as much on the American Academy of Pediatrics plan, but it's something that I always recommend with my families. It's really important to think about basic contingencies. So if there's, grades that you're worried about with them, attendance issues at school, they're getting into trouble with it, either at school or with their online use. It's important that they know beforehand with the media plan, what the expectation is going to be. I fully acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of this that you might not be able to do at the outset, right? Because there are tons of things you can get into online, and that's okay. But as much as you can possible, things that you maybe know your child is already struggling with a little bit that you foresee might be an issue, good to get that on paper first and foremost before they get their devices. And then when and where, as I mentioned, kind of only at home, or are they only allowed to do it in their room at home? And, again, at nighttime, should they have their devices, etc. Next slide. Yes, poll time. So will you create a media plan with your teen? I guess we should have maybe also asked if you've already created one. You can say yes for this. Yay! Oh, that's really encouraging. I'm glad. Awesome. Well, that's really good that 84% of people said yes. Hopefully many of you already have. Next slide. I was just gonna, sorry, those are just additional things to think about with the media plan. So I think now that a lot of you say that you're planning on doing a media plan with your teen or have already, I'll then like to kind of throw in this fun slide of what happens when things don't go as planned. And I say when because it's not if. Things will not go as planned. They just won't. Things always crop up. There are so many things that can crop up online that your teen can get into, such that while I've kind of been doing this work for a decade now, I'm still very impressed with all the things that I hadn't expected could crop up and then do. And I will note that even though I have done many, many media plans with families, and I will say, the majority of families that I've done media planning with, I've done so in the crisis setting and on an inpatient unit. So I'm kind of I used to do inpatient psychiatry before outpatient. And so I was kind of doing media plans like in a really high stress, intense environment where feelings and tensions were already really, really high. And it's hard. Like media planning can be really, really hard work and really tough when people are already upset and there's tension. So please just know that at the outset, like it's not something that we can just say, oh, like this media plan will get drafted and your kid will be totally fine with it and everybody will be happy and there'll be happiness in the home regarding digital devices for eternity. Like that, I've never seen that happen. So please know that if there's already tension related to digital media use in the home, the media plan can kind of make that more inflamed when you're kind of going over things. So as I said, as much as you can, try to talk about some of the things that you foresee. You know your kids better than anybody. Try to think of some of the things that might be problems at the outset. Like I know, for my 5-year-old, like she already, as embarrassed as I am to say this, already I know when she gets bored, tends to want to go to screens. I know that about her. She's just kind of naturally like moth to a flame. And I know that's something that I'm going to have to kind of monitor with her. And so as much as you know about your kids, please just try to think with your plan beforehand about stuff that might come up. But that said, this plan shouldn't be a document that is written in stone. It's kind of like ideally the Constitution. It should be living and breathing. It should be able to be amended. So you should be able to go back to the media plan and correct things and change things based on how your child's doing. If there becomes an issue that comes to light, that should then go back onto the media plan, right? It shouldn't be something that just kind of goes, well, the media plan said initially that we should do this, so I guess we'll just keep doing that, right? Your child's safety should always come first. So make sure that you go back to the media plan, revisit it, and also revisit it in good ways. If your child does make a change that you had been hoping for, like you had said, if you are able to get like all A's in your classes for this semester, then we will increase the amount of screen time you are able to use per day to 4 hours a day, right? Or something along those lines. Granted that, recommendation is 2 hours, but still you as parents have to do what you feel most comfortable with and what works best for your family. But just know that the media plan should be able to be adjusted and repeatedly readdressed. And that's the only way that it's going to work. And the last kind of the big things that I always mention are that kids will always find access. So again, you're totally well within your rights as parents to take away devices. In fact, if a kid's safety is at risk, I think that's a reasonable thing to do, but always keep in mind that kids were going to find access. And if you indefinitely say that you will not have, you say no phone and you don't tell them a time when they might get it back or what they need to do in order to get the phone back, kids will not deal with that well and they will go find access elsewhere. The uncertainty is often very, very uncomfortable for them, especially if they've been relying on it as a way to kind of help themselves with negative emotions that they're experiencing. And then as I've seen this far too many times, you really risk not hearing about some of the big stuff that might come up if you kind of put a overall, no, you can't go on any devices or any platforms. Families that I've seen that have kind of taken this absolutely no devices or no social media ever plans. And I think I'm saying this like after age 13. I do think there's kind of it has to be normative by age, but the teenagers oftentimes who aren't allowed to have any social media or internet access, it often comes out that they are in fact using anyway, they're using their friends' social media or using it behind their parents' backs. And then if something happens, and I've seen some pretty horrible things kind of happen to kids online, like bullying or blackmailing, you risk not hearing about it. So something to keep in mind. And then lastly, as I've kind of mentioned way at the very beginning, really tech and media should be used as a way to strengthen existing relationships and strengthen the strengths that your child already has. So try to, as much as possible, make their tech and media use something that the family shares. Again, if you can, use health apps, but make sure that when you are, again, a conversation, I guess, for a different day, but doing your homework about what apps are good with privacy and not selling your data to third parties. Encourage your teens to use texting to talk to you if they need to, and obviously, as much as you can, try to engage with your teenager and through technology, because that is kind of their current way of communication. So, thank you.
That was so awesome. I have all these notes of things that I want to do, and my kids are a little older now, but I guess hindsight is 2020. We did want to also point out to people that there are some crisis resources that it would be good for your kids to know. And one thing that's exciting to those of us who are in suicide prevention is that the Suicide Prevention Lifeline is going to have a 988 number. In some places, if you call it now, you get connected to psychiatric and mental health resources, behavioral health resources. But starting July 16th of this year, anywhere, if you dial 988, you're going to have access to mental health resources. And the thing that's really exciting about that is there are so many times when 911 is just not the right, they don't have the right resources for you. And so, certainly if it's a situation where somebody is, threatening other people or their own lives, 911 is a perfectly appropriate thing to call. But in other situations, 988 could be your better choice. There are some resources that are made for youth. The crisis text line is one that is particularly targeted toward youth because that's the way a lot of them communicate. You can also, the Trevor Lifeline is part of the Trevor Project, which is available particularly for youth who are LGBTQIA plus whatever. And then the Trans Lifeline is available to people in crisis and also their caregivers who might need some support and advice. The Not Okay, which is this app that you see in the middle, is like a panic button for kids. Sometimes it's really hard for them to articulate that they need help, and it could feel shameful, it could feel dangerous to them. So to have this app means that they can reach out without having to, sort of expose themselves to the people that they feel vulnerable around. And it can get them immediate support by a phone call or by text, or even by GPS location. So those are some resources. You all can download these, a PDF of these slides. I hope you do. Hope you take note of these resources that are available nationwide. So in just a couple of minutes, we're going to let Dr. Gansner have a little drink and relax for a moment, but we are going to have some questions and answers. As I said at the outset, we do have some that people had submitted with their registrations, and we're grateful for that because that gives us a chance to go through our slides also and see if we can cover things in slides rather than just in Q&A. But one thing that I hope you all see is that there's also this link to this SurveyMonkey survey. For all of our programs, we do surveys. We really want to know, has it helped you in any way? What are you taking away from it? We also want to know in this poll right now is after watching this webinar, how confident are you about supporting healthy use of technology with teens? It doesn't necessarily have to be your teens, but it's somewhat more common. So while you all are doing that, I just want to say that it's surveymonkey.com/r/TDA April 2022. So teen depression, April 2022. For all of those who do complete the survey, you'll be entered into a chance to win a free copy of a book called Screens and Teens, Connecting with Our Kids in a Wireless World. We're very excited to have the opportunity to share that with you. But it really does also give you a chance to tell us what kinds of topics you want us to be covering, what are the questions that you have, and also what kinds of actions are you going to take having watched this, because we will also want to follow up and see how that's going. So what we have found is that 46% feel confident about, I guess I can share the results, about supporting healthy use of technology. 36 are now somewhat confident, and 15% are very confident. And for those of you who are not confident, I mean, feel free to reach out and tell us what questions you still have, because we would like to help. All right, let me get that out of the way. Let me go here. Time for me to do some thank yous, very well deserved. So Dr. Gansner, we are very grateful that you have shared all of this information and your expertise and all those years of research that you've done. And thank you for doing that work, because we know that kids whose parents come to these programs are more vulnerable a lot of times, and they do need support. And so having those kinds of insights is invaluable in terms of us being able to, help the kids in our lives. We also have some very generous funders who support our work in our teen depression program, and those include the George Harrington Trust, the Jane B. Cook 1992 Charitable Trust, the Rebecca Pomeroy Foundation, the Bennett Family Foundation, yikes, sorry about that typo, the Thomas Anthony Pappas Charitable Foundation, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Suicide Prevention Program, and the John Donnelly Trust. And also, you all took time out of your evenings or afternoons, depending where you are. And if you're watching this as recorded, your mornings perhaps. We really appreciate that you take the time to learn, that you turn to us for advice and information. And you all make our programs possible. If we didn't have an audience, there wouldn't be any reason to do what we do. So encourage you to check out our website again, delve into our resources we have there. Come back in May also and see what improvements we've made. And if you're able and feel so inclined, we certainly would appreciate you making a donation. Thank you. All right, Q's and A's. What do we got here? You ready?
Ready, love or be?
Well, actually, the one question I wanted to start out with, maybe you won't answer, but I am curious what your daughter wanted to order on Amazon.
Oh, she ordered, paintball, inflatable paintball, tools. It was like, if you were gonna do paintball at home, it was like big inflatable, camo covered things that you're, I guess, like targets and things like that, paintball equipment. Yeah, it was really interesting. I don't know why. Still never figured that out. But.
It's pretty interesting. Okay, good. Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. In terms of what counts as screen time, does coding, animating, 3D modeling, are those the same kind of screen time as video games and watching YouTube? And I know you spoke some about quality, but I also don't know how that fits in with quantity.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something also that the American Academy of Pediatrics updated kind of more so in their last revision of the guidelines a couple years back, really wanting people to know that what you're doing online makes a difference. So again, if you're communicating with your family members, and usually they say, children under the age of 2 really shouldn't be on screens at all. However, they make that exception for you to, be able to see family and connect with family. I know that's really the only way that, my children would be able to see their grandparents is through technology. And things like coding and kind of online activities like that, I think are great use of screens. And I don't think they should be included within the screen time limits. I think really the screen time limits are designed more of as a kind of passive use or gaming. Obviously, if your child gets to the point where they're starting to have trouble separating from those activities like coding and whatnot, then that becomes a separate issue. But by and large, no, that those kind of active use of the internet, right? They're not including online school in those recommended hours either. So that kind of thing is typically an outlier in terms of what is allowed for daily screen time.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
how can we get our teen son to want to limit their screen time? It seems as if they don't want to do it. If they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll never give kind of blanket recommendations of like, do this. You have to do kind of what you feel most comfortable with. But I will say that I've found that on all honesty, kind of bribery, like positive reinforcement, is probably one of the best ways to get kids to get off devices. So basically, start making their device use kind of contingent on doing other things. So for some of the youth that I've treated specifically, for whom they really have had trouble separating for social media, because they find that their self-esteem maybe is kind of really suffering, and they can't quite separate, because they're kind of waiting for the responses of their comments to their posted content, or they're waiting for the likes. It's important that we encourage them to find other things. So I'll frequently tell their families to like say, okay, well, they can still engage in that as long as they're doing it safely. But they also have to do X activities first, or do something else first, and make that their use still something that they can do, but that contingent on engaging in something else. But it really depends also on why that person is using and not separating. That's the key to really all of it, is figuring out what they're doing online for the most part, and what they're spending the most time on, and what they're having the most trouble separating from, and then go from there. So.
And in terms of finding something different to do, I mean, that's a question that doesn't rely on technology.
Yes.
Do you have any advice for parents on supporting their kids in finding other activities?
Again, it really depends on what the kid is already interested in. I mean, the kids that I've treated all have thoughts of things that have been helpful for them. So I see like crafts. Yeah, so crafts is something that is commonly comes up. A lot of kids, and the studies that we've been doing, the ones where I kind of mentioned. So sorry, to backtrack, digital phenotyping, the research that I've done, is basically using one's technology to get a sense of what kids are doing in real time. So basically harnessing their phones to get a sense of how they're using the technology and what they're feeling when they're using the technology. So we have found that over the course of our studies, youth are using their technology by and large to regulate their emotions, such that their anxiety and the depression actually improve with increased screen use. And so that is, kind of finding directly conflicts with the prior evidence suggesting like it always makes things worse. I think it can sometimes make things worse in the long run, but in the immediate kind of use of the internet, the anxiety goes down, the depression gets better. So with that in mind, it's really important to find other things that also will, non-screen activities that will provide that same sort of improvement in mood. So it can be things that their child like, maybe before they started using devices so much. And I think it's also key to find things that are also sort of easily accessible and sort of more kind of maybe mindful activities. So things like crafts are great because, you don't want them to like take up watercoloring if it's something that's super, super hard for them. Something that they'll be able to engage with in a way that will provide comfort, but in a way that's not using screens.
It's also nice to find the things that have them build that sense of mastery that they can get from doing games, but other things too.
Right.
Is there a good way to support kids in self-regulation, like instead of getting sucked into YouTube for however many hours, how to get them so that they're like, yeah, this is enough, I'm ready to move on?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of interest in starting to, again, and something I've been trying to do with my research is harnessing the technology itself to start having teenagers gain the realization themselves that they're using too much. The studies that have been done, by and large, teenagers recognize that they think they use too much. Like it's not unusual for a teenager to truly actually recognize that they may be online more than they think. I think it was like 60%, the last survey that I saw, I think that they're like, I'm online too much. The trick is finding a way that they can separate, and kind of like with any sort of compulsive act or something you feel like you don't have control over, the first key is just recognizing it. And so getting sort of feedback in the moment that like you're doing something that you can't separate from, or that you that is making you maybe feel worse, is helpful for them to start realizing like, hey, I need to make a change. You have to get the buy-in. I think that's kind of mentioned before, like they'll only do it if they feel like it's kind of, there's something in it for them. If that is more use or like feeling better or accomplishing something else that they'd always been meaning to do, like that's where you have to start kind of putting your energies. And that's, which is why I say like, it sounds, so easy. Maybe it doesn't sound so easy. I'm not trying to make it sound easy. It shouldn't be easy. It's hard. It's really, really hard, because I think unfortunately we were handed this technology before anybody really realized how it was going to be used. Again, it's a separate soapbox moment, but yeah.
And you also have to battle the FOMO. So it's really hard that even if they think, yeah, I'm using this too much, there's still the issue that they have to deal with, as you talked about earlier. Okay, so what are good ways to help teens limit device use and avoid the escalation of their reaction? And my daughter loses her mind when I've put limits on her phone or tried to take it away. Are there good ways to handle this?
Yeah, that's really, really common. And I've treated so many kids for whom the reason that they were in the hospital is that exact reason. So I frequently kind of also throw out there, first and foremost, you have to be worried about safety, right? Like, no, I don't want any child to end up in the emergency room because of separating from their devices. But by and large, hopefully for many youth, they might get really angry. There may become some explosivity, but they hopefully will not engage in dangerous behavior. I think what can be really, really hard is that when you're parenting, like there's a natural tendency to kind of want to avoid that affect and avoid that upset, right? Nobody wants their child to feel upset, but we also know, and this is used frequently with like behavioral psychologists when they're trying to work on any sort of behavior that you're trying to change, you're going to see an extinction burst, which is essentially a worsening of that behavior and kind of enraged surrounding that behavior before it gets better and before they're better able to regulate. So I say that to just mention, like, you probably will, like, it's going to be hard for them to separate. You probably should expect to like have that upset and that anger and maybe them slamming a door or not wanting to talk to you for a period of time. And like, that's okay. That's to be expected, because we're asking them to separate from something that they've been using to make themselves feel better. That said, like, assuming it's safe, as much as you can, try to help just provide the things that otherwise might comfort them or make them kind of feel better when they're separating from it. Try to do that as best as possible, but expecting that it is going to be hard. I don't think there's any way to avoid that reaction. I think what's so hard is that parents oftentimes like expect that their kids should be able to separate without issue, and then are surprised when it doesn't, and then they're like, I don't want to fight, and so they just kind of let it go. And then that's just, things just build and build and build, and it gets harder and harder. I think once the decision's made that something has to be done because there are problematic effects from that child's screen time, you kind of have to go, okay, this is what's going to happen. We're going to create a media plan. As much as you can try to get the kid on board with the creation of that, great. They just need to accept that the media plan will be happening, and it's better for them to have a say in what's happening than not have a say in what's happening. You're still the parent at the end of the day, and you still have to try to protect them as best as possible while encouraging them to start exploring who they are and becoming a full-fledged adult. So,
which is interesting. Someone said, my child mimics YouTube personalities. Is this dangerous?
That's a great question. Well, the outright mimicry certainly I don't think is dangerous itself, but I will say that contagion, specifically in relation to like videos and TikTok videos and YouTube videos, that is something that is more and more of a concern. So like personally, what I've been seeing a lot of youth who've been coming in with diagnoses that are actually fairly rare. Like autism itself, while common, it would be rare for it to suddenly kind of pop up out of nowhere after 10 years. Things like dissociative identity disorder, where people are saying that they have become YouTube personalities. I've seen that actually more commonly in the last year. That's the kind of stuff that certainly will draw my attention, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily dangerous. Things are only dangerous when they become dangerous. As long as it's just mimicry and it's not starting to kind of seep into other aspects of the way that they relate to the world and function, then I think it's fine.
Yeah, they also need to develop their own self.
Yes.
and not just assume someone else's. You mentioned autism. Do you have thoughts on how to help a teen on the spectrum learn to be safe with technology and social media? Yes, I do have thoughts.
Sorry.
Yes, I do have thoughts.
Yes, I do
share them.
I have thoughts. So I always like to say, there has actually been a whole separate body of literature on teens and kids on the spectrum and their use of technology, because it's been known for quite some time that teens on the spectrum have a far harder time separating from technology and using technology safely than teens that are not on the spectrum. So that literature is very well established, and it is pretty clear. And I will say anecdotally, I've seen it a lot too. So I think it really depends again on like what the behavior is. I think if we're just talking about separation from technology in and of itself, I think it still kind of goes back to why they're using it. A lot of teens, especially more teens with kind of higher functioning spectrum disorders, tend to be more likely to want to use gaming as a way to connect with others socially, right? Like the teens still with autism still want to connect with others, and I think it's been a disservice to the diagnosis that for a long time it was thought that that wasn't true. And so, those youth can do so far more easily online. And it's that lack of, the lack of eye contact, the ability to communicate with others in a way that feels safe for them. Like that's a great way that we can encourage that. So I always say like that, if that's what they're doing it for, then fantastic. But again, like the expectations need to be there of, how much time they should spend online, and they should be able to still separate in a way that is safe. But again, it goes back to trying to find things in that, that they might be able to enjoy doing that could take the place of what the gaming is to them. So if like they're also doing the gaming as a way to soothe themselves because they're feeling uncomfortable, well, then you still kind of same as any other teenager, need to find a way that they can, other things that they'll bring that sort of same sense of soothing to them that isn't the gaming. So that's the kind of the short answer. There's certainly a lot of other things I could talk about in relation to that, but that's
we can have another program. So what age should families start using media plans?
I honestly think as early as possible. Certainly always before they get any sort of device of their own, and ideally if you're going to be allowing them to use your device for any period of time without supervision. So like, as I mentioned, I have a 5-year-old. When she uses the iPad to game, there's only like one app allowed to her. That's like the PBS Kids gaming app, and we are with her in the room, so we know what she is doing. We do not allow her to just like go on YouTube. So it really, I would say, as soon as you're giving them device access that is unsupervised.
How do you monitor all of the things that your kid should be? I mean, your kid could be watching. I mean, there's TV, there's iPads, there's iPhones, there's whatever else. Actually, computers.
I mean, there are certainly like a lot of parental controls out there, like parental control apps. I think it really depends on also kind of what your strategy is going to be. So some parents will choose the I want you to not have access strategy, in which case like there are ways to block certain like amount of time that you're like by time or by content. And then there are also the parents that are just like, I just want to know what you're using. I think there are pros and cons to both strategies depending on what issues you're, sorry, my cat is here and is hungry, what you're facing. So, again, teens are usually always going to find access. So I do somewhat tend to land on the side of like, if you're concerned about what they're doing online, then at least like an app that allows you to know what they're doing online is helpful. So I think that's, again, the kind of short answer to what can be a very long question. It really, like when safety is at risk, I think it is understandable to want to know what your child is looking at online. But I do think that there should be a place that your child has the ability online to be themselves and talk with others and have that privacy, because the privacy piece is huge still. Like that when you lose that, the child will seek out the privacy elsewhere. And then again, you're on the losing end of, you aren't going to know what's going to happen if something does happen, because they're not going to tell you because they know that they shouldn't have been using the device. So
the whole trust thing is challenging. Is there such a thing as, is there a clinical diagnosis of screen addiction or something like that?
Great question. So I wish there was a little bit more of one, because right now it really limits the ability to do research because none of us can agree on diagnostic criteria. There are researchers who think that internet addiction is an addiction, so involves that pathway. And certainly there are some imaging studies of the brain that suggest that the same pathways are involved. But then there are also researchers who think it's more of a compulsion. So then they kind of go along with that diagnostic criteria. And the closest we've been able to come to land on some sort of shared diagnosis is internet gaming disorder. Finally, when that was recognized, I think in 2019 as a diagnosis that has kind of concrete diagnostic criteria that everyone could agree on, but that only relates to gaming on the internet. It doesn't relate to screen time in and of itself. I used to, I would say several years ago, be more on the lane of like, we need to figure out an answer and figure out a diagnosis. But I think actually I've sort of given up because there's just so much heated. I mean, honestly, like going to these conferences, it's such a headache because everyone's just like, I have my own opinion and my opinion's right. And but then we lose sight of the fact that social media is still having an impact on our teens. It's going quicker and quicker by the day. We're getting further and further behind by the day. So we just need to, I think, start looking at what the impact seems to be, and kind of think, start planning how to do that, how to protect our kids and develop those healthy media habits, rather than trying to figure out like what type of disorder screen addiction is, because honestly, as researchers and scientists, we've gotten lost in the weeds. So that's a bit of my side soapbox.
I'm going to ask you one more question and then we'll do a wrap up. And for people whose questions did not get answered, we'll try to get answers for you and publish a blog post. So we'll tap Dr. Gansner for that too. As we're coming out of the pandemic, God willing, what do you see as new challenges for this population?
That's a really, really good question. It's like you set me up. So I actually just this year published a paper where we looked at kind of problematic dependency on internet use, kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID in the youth that I treat, and found that by and large, social media use increased significantly, and so did the kind of sense of dependency on the internet, which is kind of like a soft phrase for kind of internet addiction. So like teens felt that it was harder and harder for them to separate from the internet. And again, I say post-pandemic, recognizing it's during pandemic, post March 2020. We know teenagers have become far and above more dependent on screens in the last 2 years. And honestly, like, who can fault them? I mean, they were in an incredibly stressful environment where their parents were also stressed beyond belief, trying to manage their jobs from home. Like, no parent was able to navigate their kids' screen use during that time. Like, it was a fiasco for everybody. And it's totally understandable that kids are now struggling. And I think what's been really interesting is that a lot of clinicians that do treat internet gaming disorder or internet related pathologies specifically found that kids that had like social anxieties kind of related to their internet use, they got dramatically better during the pandemic and then are now struggling because they can't get back to school. So it's really important we recognize that a lot of our kids, especially the ones that had depression or anxiety before the pandemic, also if we consider Black, Indigenous, Latinx people, any person of color during the last 2 years with everything going on, also has been under far more stress, I think, than, I mean, there always are due to systemic racism, but it's just been horrible. And what they've been seeing on social media has been so triggering and traumatic for them. So it's really important that we keep that in mind, that these youth may have increasing difficulty, while it's been very hard for them to see what's going on online, separating from what's been going on online. And so keeping that in mind, now more than ever, I've been trying to alert people in at schools that it's going to be harder for kids. Some schools that I have kind of interacted with do allow the kids to have their devices at school, and it's just much harder now for kids to separate. So just keeping that in mind and kind of trying to, it's not too late ever to do a media plan and try to kind of get some ground rules in place.
It's great to know. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, I'm just going to wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
Again, thank you, Dr. Gansner, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. Please, please, please go and do our survey so that we will be able to learn from you all. Again, if you do the survey, then we will put you in the drawing to get a copy of Screens and Teens, Connecting with Our Kids in a Wireless World. We have a link here so that you can get started on your media use plan if you haven't already done it while you've been watching. And we also have another tool for people called an action plan. So I encourage you to check that out, a way of bringing the family together to solve whatever the current problem is, and work together rather than in opposition. And again, visit us at familyware.org. Thank you so much for your time. We very much appreciate it. And I hope that everyone has a good evening. Thank you so much.